coming up on 21st Century.
كله خوف بخوف من شو كلنا طلعنا من البيت من القصف مشان هيك والولاد كلهم مرضانين شو بعرفني الله يعين العالم.
If we deny access and if we deny protection to those people, we are committing the most serious sin.
As perdre a zo a família lá e primo que faz o timo tonso que detester tongana nyama.
Keeping the peace amid conflict, one of the UN's toughest challenges. Is the UN doing enough to try and prevent conflict around the world?
We as the United Nations turn around to the world and say that there is no hope. What else? I mean, you must have hope. That's our job.
And can a new set of goals, spearheaded by the United Nations, transform the world? Welcome to this special edition of 21st Century, celebrating the 70th anniversary of the United Nations. I'm James Bayes. Founded after World War II, the UN's remit is to make the world a better place by promoting peace and security, defending human rights and fostering development. Near the top of the organisation's agenda this year is a massive human rights crisis, the highest number of refugees in the history of the planet. Our first story is of people in flight, and nowhere are the numbers more overwhelming than in the Middle East, where wars are raging in Syria and in Iraq.
لا ولا فرد واحد كل قرية، لأن قرية منطقة عين عرب كبير. كل قرية يخلي محله يجي على القرية الثاني ويجي من ورانا، الثاني يجي على القرية الثاني يجي.
It's the biggest influx that Turkey have seen so far. The needs are urgent, needs are so big. Most of them are women and children.
كله خوف بخوف من شو كلنا طلعنا من البيت من القصف مشان هيك والولاد كلهم مرضانين شو بعرفني الله يعين العالم.
What is shocking is that 2014 was the year of highest number of forcefully displaced persons ever recorded, with 60 million altogether, and it definitely is an escalating crisis.
Things really are getting out of control simply because this world seems to be a world at war.
They flee from persecution, from human rights violations, and from the crippling poverty.
من العالم شحال هي يعني العيجان الصبح بدو اسوي لهم فطور ما بشي ايش بدي اسوي؟
It definitely is a human rights issue. The core of human rights is freedom from fear and freedom from want, and those are triggers of emigration.
The international community seems not to have capacity to prevent conflicts and to timely solve them. Some of them get totally out of control. If you look at Syria and Iraq, now we have 15 million people displaced in and from the two countries.
أي إنسان بالعالم بيحب بلده وبيعشق بلده، ولكن الأزمة اللي حاصلة في سوريا تجبر أي إنسان أنه يبحث عن ملجأ آمن أو بلد آمن لأجله لأجل زوجته. لأجل أطفاله.
Everybody, stay down, stay calm.
Everybody sit down and keep calm, okay? We take you all out. From this side. Okay. Okay.
أعرف حالي إني جاي على الموت وجينا بقوارب الموت، قوارب مطاطية. قارب مطاطي يحمل 140 شخص 150 شخص 140 شخص هو بيسع 20 شخص.
Some of them are carrying with them traumas that make them move. Some of them being victims of worst possible abuses. So if we deny access and if we deny protection to those people, we are committing the most serious sin.
أنا كان عندي فكرة عن أوروبا بس ما توقعتها هيك، يعني أنا بعرف إنه أوروبا بلد الحضارات، بس أنا بالنسبة اللي شفت تعامل البلدان اللي مريت فيها نهائيا، يعني ضرب، إهانة، كل شيء تعامل سيء كانوا يعاملونا فيه. فإنه كان الشعور، في ناس عم تبكي، في ناس ندمت بالساعة اللي طلعت، عم تقول، في ناس عم تقول، كانت تقول إنه يا ريت أنا متت بسوريا ولا طلعت.
They have their human rights that have to be respected, which means that they should have an opportunity to apply for asylum.
السوريين يأسانين، حتى ننام الشوارع. أنا كل العذاب تعذبته 6 شهور على الطريق تحت المطر، وقطعت جبال وديان وغابات، وما كنت يأسان لحتى يجي يأسون، وآخر مرحلة بدي أوصل فيها على بريطانيا.
You've got a swarm of people coming across the Mediterranean, seeking a better life, wanting to come to Britain because Britain has got jobs, it's got a growing economy, it's an incredible place to live, but we need to protect our borders.
Tens of thousands of people have come out on the street to protest what they call essentially an invasion.
It is very dangerous and unacceptable to portray migrants as people who are invaders, who are threatening culture of the host countries. In Lebanon, it's over 1 million refugees. So if tiny little country can take care of over 1 million refugees, well, I think Europe can take care of 200,000. Investing huge resources in additional patrols and raids in identifying migrants will not stop migration. If you seal the door, people will go through the window.
We don't have the resources to support all the victims of conflict around the world and to provide them with the very minimum level of protection and assistance. The world became a mess, and if people think that humanitarians can clean up the mess, they are wrong. We no longer have the capacity to pick up the pieces.
عشنا حياة صعبة، ولكن احنا على أرض أوروبا، ولكن قلوبنا ببلدنا إن شاء الله.
الواحد منهم يخلي وطنه دوم حزين، دوم حزين والله، دوم حزين.
Do not try to prevent migration by killing a dream of having a safe haven, of having security and having economic prospects. Try to provide for better protection of human rights and for freedom from fear and want.
While UN agencies do feed, house and educate the exploding number of displaced persons, as you've heard, their funding is falling far short of demand. Now to the Central African Republic, a nation consumed by violence, hatred and instability. In this largely forgotten crisis, restoring peace seems an almost impossible task, but that's what UN peacekeepers are striving to do. Here's our story.
Les souvenirs que moi j'ai, c'est surtout de voir nos frères qui sont tués comme des bêtes. Leur cœur était gorgé de haine, qui se sont levés et qui coupaient leurs semblables avec des couteaux, avec des machettes. Personne ne pouvait entendre la voix de la raison. C'est comme s'ils se nourrissent de la violence. On marche dans le sang pour arriver au pouvoir.
Il y a une telle pauvreté et une telle misère qu'aujourd'hui, tout est prétexte à crise, tout est prétexte à règlement de compte, tout est prétexte à vengeance.
Since the end of 2012, the Central African Republic, a small and very poor landlocked country of 4.5 million, has been convulsed by civil war and sectarian violence. A struggle over political power, land and resources now sees mainly Christian militia groups known as Anti-Balaka pitted against a mostly Muslim militia known as Ex-Seleka. The government has very limited influence beyond the capital. Effectively, much of the country has been divided up into lawless fiefdoms controlled by local militias, with criminality driving much of the violence rather than religion. For many, the only protection comes from the United Nations. UN and other international peacekeepers were deployed after the current crisis erupted.
Watching our report with me is Ian Martin, who's head of the influential publication Security Council Report. Ian also used to head UN missions in East Timor, Nepal and in Libya. Ian, we'll talk about Central African Republic in a moment, but let's talk about the whole of the peacekeeping system, because there's a record number of peacekeepers right now, over 120,000. Is the system coping or is it creaking?
It's certainly facing unprecedented challenges, and that's true not only in the sense that there are multiple crises, which is reflected in those numbers, but it's also true in terms of the complexity and the difficulty of the situations into which peace operations are now deploying. Peacekeeping started off classically in maintaining ceasefires, maintaining a line of control between formerly warring parties. It went on to support the implementation of peace agreements when they'd been negotiated, usually between two parties, one government, one rebel faction. But now the contexts in which peace operations are operating are much more messy than that. And they also pose increasing security challenges to United Nations personnel as well as to the civilians caught up in those situations.
So tell me a little bit more about the complexities of some of the current peacekeeping operations.
Well, if we take Mali, for example, it's a situation that is also deeply penetrated by al-qaeda, by violent extremists committing acts of terrorism. It means that peacekeepers are facing what are called asymmetric threats, which has resulted in extremely high levels of casualties, deaths and injuries amongst peacekeepers deployed in northern Mali. And I think there's pretty general agreement that UN Blue Helmet forces are not suitable to do counter-terrorism. But nonetheless, peacekeepers are in a context where they're subject to terrorist attacks, so one can't draw a simple line between a counter-terrorism operation and trying to maintain a peace in a context where there's a serious terrorist threat.
Let's look at the Central African Republic in that report. Now, that's a place where UN peacekeepers were sent to protect people. And instead there have been some hideous allegations of sexual abuse by UN peacekeepers. How do you change the system to stop this sort of thing happening?
Yes, that's quite right. The United Nations has not done enough to prevent, and perhaps the most important form of prevention is the swiftest possible investigation and punishment of those found to be responsible for sexual exploitation and abuse. A number of reports are pressing in that direction. The Secretary General is acting upon that. Having said that, I think we should also say that the troops deployed to the Central African Republic have undoubtedly saved the lives of a lot of civilians. So I don't think anybody should think that it was not important for there to be a deployment into the Central African Republic when there were terrible massacres taking place. But in no way is that any kind of an excuse for some of the crime.
We've talked about the Central African Republic, we've talked about Mali, the two most recent peacekeeping missions. Is the UN doing enough to try and prevent conflict and looking at early warning systems to try and see where there are problems ahead?
The UN is certainly doing a lot, and its efforts are effective in some conflict prevention, and of course one doesn't hear about successes in conflict prevention. But I think it's also not doing enough, and I think the Security Council isn't ready to apply its political pressures early enough. There are still strong national sovereignty concerns. Countries don't like being talked about early on as the crisis grows.
There are appalling conflicts where there are no peacekeepers. First of all, Syria, where so many people have died, but also Iraq, Yemen, Libya, where you used to be based. Do you think if there was more unity on the Security Council, there'd be more success in stopping these conflicts?
Certainly, they require unity in the Security Council, and that's obviously been a major problem in the case of Syria. And not only in the Security Council, they also require a genuine common effort by regional countries that have a lot of influence. The current conflict in South Sudan, and certainly the conflict in Libya, is made more complex if countries in the region support one side or another rather than give united support to the efforts of the United Nations or whoever is mediating the conflict to bring about a peaceful power-sharing outcome.
70 years on, let's look at the wider picture. Is the UN, given the problems we've seen with peacekeeping and whatever, is it still the right model for dealing with conflict around the world?
I don't think there's any alternative to a fully multilateral framework. It's very important that the UN works with regional organizations. It's important that powerful countries, those who have power internationally or in their regions, take efforts to resolve conflict. But ultimately, one requires the degree of impartiality and common effort that I think only the United Nations can bring.
In Martin, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us. Now, at the turn of the millennium, world leaders set targets to make the planet a better place by 2015. The results have been mixed. Extraordinary progress alongside some significant failures. And now the United Nations is looking at new ways to make sure no one is left behind.
Over the last 25 years, I'd say the biggest impact that we've made is reducing those that are living in poverty, particularly extreme poverty, by half. We've seen more than 90% of children get into primary school for a basic education. And we have reduced the rate of children who are dying before their 5th birthday by half. These are remarkable progresses. However, there's still much to do. We're developing a new set of goals. They're universal, they're integrated, and they're over a period of time that we think that we can build on what we have done with the last set of goals. What hasn't worked with the first set of goals that we had was that we really didn't look at the root causes. It was more of addressing some of the symptoms.
In the 2 decades since Mozambique's civil war ended, the country has made an amazing recovery. But not all citizens are participating in the country's new opportunities. 15-year-old Ilse Gwambe is one of them. Ilse, then just 13 years old, was unable to continue school. In rural Mozambique, moving in with a boyfriend's parents constitutes a marriage. More than half the girls in the country are married before the age of 18, one of the highest rates of child marriage in the world.
Well, the story of this teenage girl is, of course, so sad in a country that has so much hope with their new dawn, that she doesn't have an education, that perhaps her family doesn't have an education, which in turn would have made her better and more equipped to deal with relationships and not end up in the situation that she did. This is part of what we are trying to promote, is that everyone gets an education and therefore are empowered to take the decisions that they need to, but also to move governments to put in legislation that actually protects girls.
Let us pick up our books and our pens. They are our most powerful weapons. One child, one teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world. Education is the only solution. Education first. Thank you.
It reminds me not so long ago where I had my first cousin who went to school with me, and we were growing up together quite happily until my grandmother came to take her away one day, and we couldn't quite understand. We just knew that my grandmother was one of those pillars in the family that you didn't argue with. And she took her back to the village. She'd married 6 children later. And when we sit down to reflect on our lives, where I am today and where she is, and we know quite clearly, had she had an education, she probably would have done much better than I've done, because she was so much smarter.
Another major challenge is the rise of violent extremism, both a symptom and a cause of lagging development. Boko Haram are still active in northeast Nigeria, and nearly 16 million Nigerians are affected by food insecurity, malnutrition, epidemics and conflict, including these refugees who fled to neighbouring Chad after Boko Haram attacks.
Well, countering violent extremism around the world, I think we do have to address the root causes. I hope that we don't make this a case of a Band-Aid, because it will only fester, and that means that everyone is insecure, regardless of the country that you're in. I can take examples from my own country, the northeast of Nigeria, Maiduguri. I went to school there. Young men are not born terrorists. It's an environment that creates that. And we need to look at what happened. How were they so excluded they saw no hope, and that they became easy fodder for people to use in the way they have done, and that becomes a tragedy for everyone.
The Pacific Ocean occupies nearly 1/3 of the Earth's surface and contains one of the planet's most diverse ecosystems. Thousands of species thrive in these waters. Pacific coral reefs and the marine environments they sustain provide food and livelihoods for over 120 million people, including the inhabitants of a tiny cluster of islands known as the Cook Islands. And for one Cook Islander, the ocean has a deeply personal meaning.
At a young age, 7 or 8, I'd spend every day, in the sea and in the oceans, fishing and out on boats. It just becomes part of you.
Though his career as a rugby player took him away from his native Cook Islands, Kevin returned as often as he could. Each time he noticed alarming changes in the ocean. Fishermen catching fewer fish, dying coral, and growing commercial interests pursuing resources around the Cook Islands.
I hope for the sake of small islands like that and vulnerable communities, even on the oceans, the coastlines that we talk about, we see so much investment going in there because trade is important, and so ports are being built where infrastructure is happening. But, the rising sea levels are going to take away a lot of those investments that we're putting down, and that'll be gains that are lost. Without hope, what else is there? I think that, we as the United Nations, that's our job. We can never turn around to the world and say that there is no hope. What else? I mean, you must have hope.
Well, that's all for this special edition of 21st Century, celebrating 70 years of the UN. I'm James Bays. Thanks for watching.